Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Nicole if you don't know me, and this is my K-beauty skincare education channel, and today we're going to be talking about the Purito Sunscreen Scandal and sort of are brands lying to us now about SPF in sunscreen and how long has this been going on for. So let's just get into the video. So the two sunscreens that are in the spotlight here are these Purito Centella Green Level Unscented Sun with SPF 50 PA++++, and then also the Comfy Water Sunblock, which is a mineral sunscreen. The green level is a chemical, is also in question, and this is because the INCI decoder founder did a test of her own on this sunscreen rather extensively with different labs, and basically found out that this sunscreen was around a 19 SPF. And that really shocked a lot of people when it was posted on Instagram, because everyone was like, what the hell, my favorite Korean sunscreen is SPF 19, not 50. And Purito, which is a Korean skincare brand, actually claimed that this sunscreen was actually 84 SPF. First, I want to get into what the heck is sunscreen and why does it matter, and all of the intricacies that come with understanding sunscreen so that you can better understand this controversy and perhaps why it might not be as bad as you think it is. So in terms of the difference between US and Korean sunscreens, one of the differences is the testing and also what the countries respectively consider sunscreens. So in America, the one issue that a lot of brands run into is the fact that America considers sunscreen a drug. So it has to be very heavily regulated by the FDA as a drug as such, because technically it's claiming to protect against skin cancer or cancer. And that really places a lot of restrictions on brands who make sunscreens in different countries. And that's because America has not approved certain UV filters that are used to protect our skin from the sun's rays. UV filters are the filters that are used in sunscreens that help to protect us from different levels and different wavelengths of the sun's rays that give us sunburn. Basically, the US has not approved certain higher tech, more improved modern UV filters because we are a bit behind. And because we are behind in improving certain filters, there are other countries like Korea that are already ahead of the game and want to sell their sunscreens in America, but can't claim them as a sunscreen or can't say that they protect against skin cancer, that kind of stuff, because that would then mean that the FDA in America has to regulate them, and then they would get turned down because they have UV filters that are not allowed in America. So a lot of international brands, because they technically cannot sell their sunscreen as a sunscreen in America, will then relabel it as something else and won't claim that it can protect against skin cancer or cancer. So that's how this sunscreen, although made in Korea, although has very unique and different UV filters and tends to be more gentle on the skin, can be sold in America because technically it's not a sunscreen in America. So we are not technically regulating it. In Korea, the KFDA considers sunscreen not a drug but a functional cosmetic, although it's still tested rather rigorously. I wouldn't say that the fact that it's not considered a drug means that it's less valuable or less reliable, but it's just different. And that's all I want you guys to know. It means nothing in terms of quality or quality of testing. They still test these sunscreens rather rigorously in Korea so that they can be sold safely to the public. Now let's talk about UV rays and what are UV rays and what causes sunburn. So there are two different types of rays. There's UVA and there's UVB. UVB, you can always remember, causes burns or is the main cause of a burn on the skin because it ends with the letter B. So UVB for burn, and then UVA is for aging. UVA is the ray that will cause aging, So the A in UVA you can remember as the age-causing ray, and then the B in UVB will be remembered as the burn-causing ray. And these are the two rays that our sunscreens protect us against. So basically, you know that your sunscreen protects against the UVA and UVB rays if it says broad spectrum on it. Broad spectrum means that it protects against both UVA and UVB. But when we look at Korean sunscreens, they're definitely a little bit different. They don't always say broad spectrum. So they usually say SPF 50, and then they have something that says like PA++++. So the SPF is the sun protection factor, and that indicates that your sunscreen is protecting it against UVB rays. And then the PA on here with all the different plus signs, that basically just means that your sunscreen is protecting against UVA rays, and the amount of plus signs is equivalent to the amount of protection, the amount of wavelength or the length of the wave that it's going to protect against. So if you have a lot of pluses on here, like 4 pluses, which is usually the most, that means that it's protecting against larger wavelengths, broader spectrums of UVA, whereas if it had like 1 plus, it would be a shorter spectrum of UVA. So this sunscreen here is actually very protective according to the packaging. So again, to kind of talk about the different types of sunscreens, there's a mineral sunscreen and a chemical sunscreen. And the difference between the two is that mineral usually uses things like zinc and titanium to protect against UVB and UVA rays. And then the chemical sunscreens will use chemical UV filters. Usually you'll see them often in American sunscreens. They usually start with an O, like octinoxidate or something like that, something crazy like that. Chemical sunscreens tend to leave less of a white cast, whereas the mineral sunscreens will usually leave more of a white cast on the skin just because of the nature of the ingredients. So basically what happened with Purito sunscreen, let's get into that. The founder of Inky Decoder, I believe it's the founder, she conducted or sent this sunscreen out to get tested by different labs to see if the SPF in here was correct. She was a little skeptical and she wanted to send it out. The Inky Decoder is a website that you can go to search up individual ingredients or to see ingredient lists of products, and they'll break down the ingredient list bit by bit, telling you what the ingredient is, what benefits it has, etc. So basically the founder of Inky Decoder sent this out to a lab for in vitro testing. In vitro testing is in lab testing on like, kind of like fake skin. But when in vitro testing is done, although it is a good test to have, you should be doing in vitro and in vivo. So in vivo is like on real human skin, and in vitro is in like a lab setting. In vitro testing usually, or actually it does not count as a test that can be put on your sunscreen label. You have to do an in vivo test on a real person to be able to actually label your sunscreen as it shows up on other people. So basically, they sent this out for an in vitro test, and they tested it to see what the SPF, the protection factor, would be, and basically it was 15.8. So because of that, they decided to send this out for some in vivo testing. They did 2 separate tests for the in vivo, which means on a person, and they did a 10-person group, and they got around 19. And then they did it again, another in vivo test on real people, and then they got around 19 as well. So essentially, this sunscreen sort of came out to be around like 18, 19 SPF max, according to these 3 tests. And yeah, shit, man. So going back to the difference between Korea and America, so in America, they have the FDA testing system, but in Korea, they have the ISO 24444 testing system. And I think Europe also uses this testing system as well, but essentially the testing systems are slightly different, but honestly really not that different. So the next thing I want to talk about is this myth called the 50 SPF myth. People think the higher the SPF, the more protection you'll get. And although that is true in some cases, anything really over a 15 SPF is quite negligible. So what I mean by that is that the percentage of sun rays that a 15 SPF protects against in comparison to a 50 is negligible, or it's just very, very small. Now, obviously, there would be a little bit more protection if you were to get a 50 SPF sunscreen than a 15, but the percentage is like 2 or 3% difference between the amount of sun rays that you are protected from. SPF, again, is sun protection factor, and it's supposed to tell you how long you're going to be protected against UVB rays. Let's say you have a 15 SPF, that basically means that you'd be protected 15 times longer than if you were to not wear sunscreen at all. Now, although that is true, the issue with that is that people think that if they get like a SPF 100, they don't have to reapply, and it doesn't really matter, you'll be protected forever. That's not true. You'll actually never be fully protected from the sun rays ever. There's always going to be a percentage that you are not protected from, which is why reapplication is mandatory. And no matter the high amount of SPF that you have, you should always be reapplying sunscreen every 1 to 2 hours. If you have 15 SPF and you have 110 SPF, you should be reapplying those at majority the same time. And honestly, there is really no difference between 15 and 110. So actually with SPF 15, it protects against 93% of UVB rays, and then with SPF 30, I'm reading off my notes, it protects you against 97%, and then with SPF 50, it protects you against 98% of UVB rays. So the discrepancy here and the issue here is that really between SPF 50 and SPF 15, there's only 5 percentage points that separate the amount of UVB protection that you're gonna get. So of course, it's always better to probably just go higher, but it really isn't gonna do you like so much justice. Like, you are now the sunscreen god if you have SPF 50. If you use SPF 15, it's really going to do the same job. So I bet you guys are kind of like, all right, so I get that it's not as bad, whatever, but like, why did this happen? Why is the sunscreen not 50? Why is it 19? That's kind of a lot. You'd be surprised how often this happens with so many of our favorite sunscreens. So the one thing I want to say is that brands like Neutrogena and La Roche-Posay have had similar scandals, but no one has really said anything about it. Probably because sunscreen or skincare hasn't really been that popular, and these types of scandals actually happen all the time. It's actually really common for sunscreens not to be tested as the SPF that they are labeled as. And there's actually a deviant or a certain number of distance that a sunscreen can be from its labeled SPF that labs will actually say, okay, well, you can actually consider this 50 SPF. That is one point. And the next point is that when brands go to labs to test sunscreens, there tends to be a bias. So there was actually a study done where a company gave a sunscreen that was 100 SPF, and they gave it to one lab, and they told that lab that it was actually in between 70 to 90 SPF. Now mind you, it's 100 SPF behind the scenes, but they told the lab that it was in between the 70 to 90 range. That lab tested it, and they got in between that range. They gave it to another lab and said, this sunscreen is 80 SPF, period, nothing else, right? So that lab tested it, and they got around 80 SPF, like very, very close. They didn't get what the other lab got, they didn't get a range, they got, 79, 80, 81, in that range. So basically, this sunscreen, while being 100 SPF, got multiple different SPF numbers based on what the company was telling the lab they believed this SPF was. So basically what that is supposed to show you guys, and if it was too confusing to understand, I totally get it, because honestly, I'm still confused explaining it, but what it's supposed to tell you is that labs actually have biases, and they want to meet the goals that the brands are setting for them. So For example, if Purito came to a lab and said, we think this is 80 SPF, that lab may have just gotten those results because they want to meet the brand's expectations. And this has happened in not just Purito, possibly. I believe it honestly was that. I think it was lab bias. And I think the lab tried to meet a certain expectation of the brand and kind of, you know, not necessarily fudge the numbers, but in the example that I showed you before, tried to really achieve that range, even if that range wasn't necessarily correct. And that does happen with a lot of sunscreens, and it's happened with big brands, like I said, Neutrogena, La Roche-Posay. These brands have had these scandals where they say they're this certain SPF and they tend to be not that. So at the end of the day, don't go around thinking that, you know, Purito and Korean sunscreens are bad. That's not true. This happens with a lot of your favorite Western brands. So honestly, maybe there needs to be a reconstruction of how we test our SPFs and maybe a better regulation of these labs that might be giving into lab bias and trying to meet these standards of these brands. So I really think there's a lot of system failure here rather than just brand failure. And I know Purito still taking a little bit of a long time, but they are testing these products and they're giving refunds, and they stopped the sale of them, I believe, and they're retesting them again to make sure. So if you guys are interested in what other sunscreens you could use besides the Purito sunscreen, I'm just going to quickly do a flash round of sunscreens that I really like, both Korean and Western brands that you guys could try. So the first sunscreen I want to talk about is Tizo. This is a mineral-based sunscreen formulation, has zinc oxide, also titanium dioxide and zinc oxide, and they are broad spectrum mineral. And what I love about these is that they are actually a bit tinted, and the tint doesn't add color to the face. It's only supposed to aid in removing white cast, which it does beautifully. So if you have darker skin tones, then I recommend looking into Tizo as a gentle mineral-based sunscreen that will also be helpful for dark skin tones because of its tinted nature. Next thing I want to talk about is the Clarins Midday Blue UV Shield. So this is a mineral sunscreen. It's also SPF 50, PA++++, broad spectrum. Next thing I want to recommend is the Nude Finish Tinted Moisturizer SPF 15. This is by Bobbi Brown. You can get honestly any tinted moisturizer that you want. It doesn't have to obviously be this, but I recommend these for also darker skin tones because it also is a blend of makeup and SPF. The only thing I would say is that SPF tends to get diluted when it's blended with like makeup or moisturizers, but I would just say then that means that you have to reapply it more often. But this is like a concealer or like a BBCC cream that you can use. It actually does have tint in it. Next one I have here is the Neogen Probiotics Relief Sun Essence. It's 50 SPF and it's beautiful. It reminds me of the Beach Shield, which is also a great sunscreen for dark skin tones, and this is also a great sunscreen, I believe, for dark skin tones, and it really has no cast. It blends just like the Beach Shield. And the last one I want to talk about is the Sundays SPF 30 Broad Spectrum. This is made in America, and it is a mineral sunscreen, and the only thing I would say about this is that it does leave a little bit of a white cast and it's very thick, but I do personally like it. It smells really nice. So thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, leave them down below and tell me what videos you want to see next, and make sure to watch the 2 in the end screen. Bye guys.